The Last Dinner at Blackwood Hall. A Hercule Poirot Mystery, Chapter 1. An invitation written in ink and unease. The village of Crestmore lay in that particular stillness which belongs only to November in the English countryside, a hush not of peace, but of held breath. The lane that wound towards Blackwood Hall was canopied by elms stripped bare of their leaves, branches interlaced overhead, like the fingers of old men in consultation. It was along this lane, on the evening of the 14th, that 6 motor cars arrived in careful succession, bearing guests whose polite smiles concealed, as Hercule Poirot would later observe, most remarkable variety of private anxieties. Blackwood Hall itself was a house that wore its age with a certain grim satisfaction. Built in 1782 by the first Blackwood to make his fortune in wool, it had endured floods, fires, slow erosion of family fortune with equal indifference. Its stone facade was the colour of old pewter, its tall windows glittered with reflected sky, and the great oak front door bore a brass knocker shaped in the form of a fox's head, a detail that Hall's current owner, Mr. Reginald Blackwood, considered both ancestral and auspicious. Reginald Blackwood was 61 years of age, lean as a winter tree, with a face that had once been handsome and now was merely commanding. He had invited 7 guests to what he described in his letters as a small gathering to mark the occasion of my return to Blackwood Hall after 3 years abroad. The letters had been written in his own precise hand on cream vellum, each one personalised with a sentence or two of private recollection that made the recipient feel singularly chosen. This was a gift. Reginald possessed in abundance the ability to make each person feel they were his one true confidant, even as he practised the same art upon 7 others simultaneously. The guests assembled in the drawing-room at 7:30. Mrs. Dorothea Fenchurch arrived, first as she invariably did, for she considered punctuality a form of dominance. She was 54, widow of independent means, with silver hair arranged in an immaculate chignon and eyes the colour of February skies, grey, cool, capable of considerable frost. She and Reginald had known one another for 30 years, and whatever had once existed between them had curdled, by degrees, into something that functioned as friendship while containing the structural integrity of old ice. Next came Mr. Felix Carow, Reginald's solicitor, a compact man of 47, with a perpetual air of mild apology, though he spent his days bringing bad news, and had adjusted his posture accordingly. He carried a leather brief-case, which he set beside the mahogany sideboard with the careful precision of a man accustomed to the weight of other people's secrets. The Honourable Sylvia Torrent arrived upon the arm of her husband, Dr. Edmund Torrent, a pairing that produced, in any room it entered, a subtle atmospheric disturbance. Sylvia was 32 and radiant in an amber gown, the kind of beauty that drew every eye in a room and consequently produced, in her husband, a chronic low-grade alertness. Edmund was 45, physician of distinguished reputation and domestic unhappiness, and he wore his fine evening clothes with the slightly distracted air of a man whose mind was elsewhere performing surgery. Then came Miss Harriet Voss, Reginald's niece by his late sister, a young woman of 26, whose manner combined intellectual sharpness with social awkwardness in proportions that left most people uncertain how to treat her. She had her uncle's high forehead and her mother's restless hands, and she arrived carrying a book, which she tucked quickly into her evening bag when she realised no one else had brought one. Finally, completing the party, was Mr. Lawrence Crane, a name which some of those present received with a fractional but perceptible stiffening of posture. Crane was 40, American-born, though long resident in England, with the easy confidence of a man who had earned his money himself, and consequently felt no obligation to apologise for having it. He was handsome, measured in his speech and his history with Reginald Blackwood. A business partnership that had ended 3 years ago in litigation and mutual recrimination was known to all in the room, though no one mentioned it. Reginald greeted each of them in the hall with warm handshakes and the particular smile of a man executing a plan. His housekeeper, Mrs. Agnes Plum, a solid woman of 60 in a black dress that had seen better decades, directed the footman in distributing sherry. Fire in the drawing-room blazed with orange excess. On the mantelpiece, a French clock ticked with metronomic patience. Conversation was accomplished and surface-bright, touching on the quality of the roads, the state of Parliament, and the excellence of the Chateau Margaux, which Reginald's cellar had produced for the occasion. Yet beneath it, as Captain Hastings would later confide to Poirot, there was a quality to the gathering that he could not precisely identify, but which made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle in a manner not entirely attributable to the November chill. I felt, Hastings wrote in his notes, as though I had arrived at the first act of a play in which all the other actors already knew the ending. At 10 minutes past 8, Reginald rose from his chair by the fire, touched his glass lightly against the mantel clock, and addressed the room with the measured warmth of a man delivering a prepared speech. He thanked them for coming. He said that he had much to discuss over dinner, matters of some importance to all of them. He said there would be no unpleasant surprises. He said this with a smile that produced in at least 3 of his listeners the opposite effect of the one intended. Dinner was announced at 8:30 precisely. The 7 of them moved through to the dining room, where 8 places had been laid. The 8th, Reginald's right hand, was empty. Reginald explained that he expected a final guest momentarily. A Mr. Arthur Peel, his financial adviser, telegraphed to say he would be slightly delayed. They would begin the soup, and Mr. Peel would join them directly. Mr. Peel did not join them. He did not arrive at all that evening. And by midnight the question of his absence had been entirely eclipsed by a considerably more alarming event, for Reginald Blackwood, host and architect of the evening, was found dead in his study at 11:45, slumped in his leather chair, his lips faintly discoloured, his half-finished glass of brandy still warm on the desk beside him. And in that room of 7 guests, every one of them had, as Poirot would discover, both a reason to want him dead and a story about why they could not possibly have done it. Chapter 2. The Body in the Leather Chair. It was Mrs. Agnes Plum who found him. She had gone to the study at 11:45 to inform Mr. Blackwood that 2 of the guests were asking after the port, which had not appeared since the decanter was removed from the sideboard during the confusion following Miss Voss's faint, of which more in a moment. Mrs. Plum was not a woman given to dramatic response. She had managed Blackwood Hall through a kitchen fire, a burst pipe, and the death of the previous owner with equivalent composure. She opened the study door, saw what was inside, and returned to the drawing-room with an expression that caused every conversation in the room to stop simultaneously. "I must ask," she said, "that no one leave this house." It was Dr. Edmund Torrent who went first to the study, as was natural. The others followed at a cautious interval, clustering in the doorway with the instinctive hesitation of people confronting something that cannot be taken back. Reginald Blackwood sat in the deep leather chair behind his mahogany desk. The chair he had occupied since inheriting the hall, chair in which, by his own account, he had made every significant decision of his life. He was not quite upright. Body had settled to the left, his head inclined, his right hand resting on the desk, beside the brandy glass with the loose particularity of a man simply fallen asleep. Except that no sleeping man has that particular stillness, that absolute cessation of the unconscious movement which living bodies cannot prevent. Dr. Torrent made his examination with professional economy, touching the pulse point, lifting one eyelid, noting the faint bluish tinge of the lips and the slight dilation of the pupils. He stood and turned to face the gathered faces in the doorway. His voice was steady. "He is dead, I should estimate, within the last hour. Beyond that I cannot say without a further examination. The cause is not immediately evident." He paused. Then he added quietly, "I should advise that the police be telephoned immediately, and that nothing in this room be disturbed. Constable from Crestmore village arrived within 20 minutes. A young man named Briggs who was visibly out of his depth, and admirably honest about it. He sealed the study, took down the names of all present, requested that no one leave the hall that evening, telephoned the county detective inspector, a Mr. Thorne, who arrived at 20 past midnight, accompanied by a police surgeon. Inspector Thorne was 50, methodical, and possessed of the particular patience of a man who has spent 25 years watching people lie to him. He examined the study for 40 minutes before speaking to the assembled guests, who by this time had been reunited in the drawing room where the fire had burned low and someone, no one could afterwards say who, had poured themselves a very large whisky. The police surgeon's preliminary finding was delivered to Inspector Thorne in the hallway, out of earshot of the guests. But the hall's acoustics were imperfect, and Lawrence Crane, standing nearest the door, heard the words "cyanide compound" and "brandy glass" with sufficient clarity to share them in a murmur with Mrs. Fenchurch beside him. Brandy glass. It sat on the desk, perhaps a third full, its contents undisturbed. Reginald Blackwood had been poisoned. Not shot, not struck, not strangled. Poisoned. With a substance introduced into a glass that had stood on the desk in his locked study room he had entered alone at 10:30, excusing himself from the drawing-room gathering with the explanation that he had a brief letter to write and would rejoin the company shortly. He had not rejoined them, and no one in the drawing-room could say, with perfect certainty, that they had not stepped away from the gathering themselves during the hour between 10:30 and 11:30. This was the hour of the crime. Miss Harriet Voss had, she said, gone upstairs at 20 minutes to 11 to retrieve a shawl, a matter of perhaps 8 minutes. Mrs. Fenchurch acknowledged that she had visited the cloak-room at approximately 11 o'clock, and had been gone some time, as she had a headache and required a moment of quiet. Felix Carrow said he had been in the drawing-room throughout, statement that no one could confirm or refute with confidence. Dr. Torrent admitted that he had stepped into the corridor at approximately 10:50 to take some air, as the room had become uncomfortably warm. His wife, Sylvia, had gone to the telephone at around 11 to attempt to reach a friend in London, and had been engaged for some 15 minutes. Lawrence Crane, the last to speak, and the one whose face remained most carefully composed, said he had remained in the drawing-room for the entirety of the hour, save for a brief excursion to the billiard-room, which joined the corridor that led to the study wing, to collect a cigar from the case he had left there. Every one of them had moved. Every one of them, therefore, had had the opportunity to enter the study corridor and introduce something into the brandy glass. But the study door had been locked from the inside. This was the detail that produced, in Inspector Thorne's methodical mind, a sensation of carefully suppressed bewilderment. The door had been found locked. Mrs. Plum had used her housekeeper's master key to gain entry. No windows had been opened. They were latched from the inside. The chimney, Inspector Thorne's constable confirmed, structurally incapable of accommodating a person. The room was sealed, yet the brandy glass contained poison. It was during Inspector Thorne's second interview with Felix Carrow, conducted in the library at 1:30 in the morning, while rain began against the windows, that the solicitor mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had received, 3 days previously, a telephone call from Reginald Blackwood, asking whether his will was still in proper order. Reginald had asked this in a manner Carrow described as curiously emphatic. He had also asked whether the document could be contested if a beneficiary were to claim undue influence. Carrow had told him no, and Reginald had said, "Good, that is as it should be," and rung off. It was at this point in the investigation that Inspector Thorne did something unusual. He telephoned London. Specifically, he telephoned a number in Whitehaven Mansions, where a small, precise Belgian gentleman was at that moment engaged in the organisation of his sock drawer, and requested his assistance. The following morning, a hired motor car turned into the elm-canopied lane towards Blackwood Hall, and Hercule Poirot arrived. Chapter 3. Poirot descends upon the grieving house. He arrived at 9:47 in the morning, having insisted upon a good breakfast before departing his hotel in Crestmore. A bowl of hot chocolate and 2 slices of bread, with considerably more butter than the establishment considered appropriate. He was a small man who dressed with a precision that the English countryside found faintly bewildering. A dark overcoat of impeccable cut, patent leather shoes that met the gravel drive with obvious distaste, a pair of lavender gloves, a hat set at an angle so exact that Hastings, who accompanied him, had once speculated that Poirot employed a spirit level. Hastings had in fact encountered Poirot 3 days earlier at his London club, and had made the happy mistake of mentioning that his old acquaintance, Lawrence Crane, had invited him to spend a few days in the Crestmore vicinity. It was a coincidence that Poirot would later describe as, in his characteristic fashion, not a coincidence at all. For Providence, he maintained, frequently arranged the scenery in advance of the drama. By the time Inspector Thorne's telephone call arrived, Poirot was in the neighbourhood. Poirot was already in the neighbourhood and required only a motor car and 40 minutes to reach the scene. Mrs. Plum received him at the door with the expression of a woman who has sent for a plumber and been delivered a philosopher. She showed him to the library, where Inspector Thorne was waiting. The two men shook hands with the mutual esteem of professionals who have met before, found each other useful, if occasionally incompatible. "The room remains sealed?" Poirot asked, removing his gloves with the methodical care he devoted to all actions, however small. "It does," said Thorne. "Brandy glass has been taken for analysis. Initial results confirm potassium cyanide in a concentration sufficient to cause death within 15-30 minutes of ingestion. And the glass itself, from where did it come? The decanter on the desk, or was it brought from elsewhere?" Thorne blinked. It was, Hastings noticed, the blink of a man who has not yet asked himself this question. "The decanter on the desk," he said, slightly less certainty than before. There was a decanter and 2 glasses on the study sideboard, 1 glass used, 1 clean. The decanter, has it been analysed? "It has not contained poison," said Thorne. "The second glass was also clean." "So the poison was introduced into the glass already poured," Poirot said softly. "Not into the decanter, not into the bottle, into the single glass that Monsieur Blackwood had already begun to drink. This is precise. This is personal. This was done by someone who knew which glass he was drinking from." He asked then to see the study, and Thorn took him there. Poirot stood in the doorway for a full 2 minutes without moving, his eyes traversing the room with the unhurried patience of a man reading a letter rather than examining a crime scene. He noted the desk, large, Victorian, positioned to face the door, the leather chair behind it, the sideboard to the left bearing the decanter, the fireplace to the right, its grate cold, the bookshelves on 3 walls, wet con. Their volumes ordered with the particular randomness of a man who actually reads his books, writing slope beside the blotter, bearing a half-completed letter. The letter. Reginald had excused himself to write, apparently begun and then abandoned. He crossed to the desk and examined the half-written letter. It was addressed to someone identified only by initials, A.P., and read, in Reginald's precise hand, "Dear Arthur, I have been turning over the matter of our last conversation, and find myself unable to proceed as agreed. There is something I have not told the others, something which I have been." It ended there, mid-sentence, mid-thought, pen discarded across the blotter as though the writer had been interrupted. "Arthur Peel," murmured Hastings from the doorway, the guest who never arrived. "The guest who was expected," Poirot corrected gently. "Whether he was truly absent is a matter we have not yet established." He examined the lock, a good solid mortise, engaging when turned from the inside by the key which still resided in the lock on the interior face. He looked at the window latches. He examined the fireplace with particular attention, though he spent perhaps the longest time before the small mahogany occasional table beside the leather chair upon which rested an empty crystal dish the approximate size of a lemon. He said nothing about this, but Hastings noticed him photograph it in his memory with the focused stillness that indicated significance. When Poirot emerged from the study, he asked to see the guests. Not collectively, individually, in sequence, beginning with the person least likely to be guilty, proceeding to the most likely, and ending with the one who appeared to have no motive whatsoever. This last was his preferred starting point for the truth. "In my experience," he told Hastings as they walked back to the library, "the person with no motive is invariably concealing the most important one." He began with Miss Harriet Voss. She came into the library with her hands folded and her chin set at the angle of a person prepared to be underestimated, pale from the night's events, but composed, her dark eyes steady behind the oval frames of her spectacles. She sat across from Poirot and waited for him to speak first, which he did not do immediately. He simply regarded her with his pale green eyes. Those eyes that Hastings had often described as seeing considerably more than was offered to them. "You are the niece," he said at last. "Miss Voss. Your mother was the late sister of Monsieur Blackwood." "Eleanor Voss, yes," she said. "She died 4 years ago." "And your uncle, you were close?" A pause. "Brief but measurable." "We were not estranged," she said. "That is not the same thing," observed Poirot pleasantly. She allowed the ghost of a smile. "No," she agreed, "it is not." Poirot asked about the shawl she had retrieved during the critical hour. She described the route to her room, up the main staircase, along the east corridor, 3rd door. She had been gone, she thought, 8 to 10 minutes. She had not passed the study corridor. She had had no reason to do so. She had not seen anyone else in the upper portion of the house. As she rose to leave, Poirot asked, with the casualness of a man asking about the weather, "Mademoiselle, the crystal dish on the occasional table beside your uncle's chair. Do you know what it usually contained?" She stopped. Something shifted behind her eyes. "Sugared almonds," she said after a moment. "He had a fondness for them. He always kept a dish of them in the study. Last night. Did you notice whether the dish was full or empty when dinner began?" She thought. "Full," she said. I noticed it when I retrieved a book from the study shelves before dinner. The dish was full. Poirot thanked her and watched her leave. Then he turned to Hastings with an expression of quiet satisfaction that Hastings had learned over many years to treat with great attention. Dish, said Poirot, was empty when we examined the room this morning, and yet no sugared almonds were found anywhere in that room. None on the floor, none in the waste paper basket, none upon the body. They did not eat themselves, mon ami, and this raises a most interesting question. Where did they go? Offered Hastings. Not merely where, said Poirot, but why. Chapter 4. 6 portraits, each missing something. The interviews proceeded through the morning with the methodical rhythm of a man sorting correspondence. Each envelope opened with equal care, its contents assessed for relevance, nothing discarded as trivial. Poirot had learned over many decades that what a witness considered unimportant was frequently the very thing that mattered most, and that what a witness was careful to emphasize was almost certainly a misdirection, however unconscious. Felix Carrow came second. He settled himself with the precise posture of a man accustomed to being on the professional side of uncomfortable conversations, and answered each question with a solicitor's measured economy. Yes, he had known Reginald Blackwood for 19 years. He had become his solicitor upon the retirement of the previous firm that handled Blackwood affairs. Yes, he had administered the estate during Reginald's 3 years abroad. Yes, the will was in proper order. He had reviewed it, as requested, 3 days before the dinner, and yes, he confirmed what he had told Inspector Thorne. Reginald had telephoned about contested wills and undue influence, and had seemed, Carrow's professional assessment, anxious. Anxious how, monsieur? Asked Poirot. Anxious as a man who fears he has acted unwisely, or anxious as a man who fears that others will act against him? Carrow considered this with evident care. The latter, he said at last. He was, I would say, protective. He was checking the locks, so to speak. And the will itself, you are not at liberty to share its contents, naturally, but I ask only this. Does it produce in those who benefit from it material advantage sufficient to constitute a motive for removing Monsieur Blackwood before he could change it? Carrow was quiet for a moment. Then he said with perfect professional correctness, I would observe that a will becomes operative upon death. That Monsieur Blackwood had mentioned, in that same telephone call, that he was considering certain revisions. He paused. He had not made those revisions. Poirot thanked him. When Carrow had gone, Hastings looked up from his notebook with bright eyes. Someone stood to inherit, and if Blackwood had changed his will, they would have lost it, précisément. But note, Hastings. This applies to more than one person in this house. A will with multiple beneficiaries can provide multiple motives. We must proceed carefully. Mrs. Dorothea Fenchurch arrived in a grey wool dress that matched her hair and her eyes with a coordination that was either accidental or the achievement of a formidable aesthetic intelligence. She sat with perfect posture, and answered questions with the controlled fluency of a woman who has spent decades in rooms full of people who underestimated her. She had known Reginald Blackwood since 1921. She described their relationship as of long standing. She had no knowledge of his financial affairs beyond the general awareness that the Blackwood estate, once considerable, had contracted significantly during Reginald's time abroad. She had visited the cloakroom during the critical hour, for perhaps 12 minutes, she thought, though possibly longer. She had a migraine and had required her medication, which she produced from her handbag, a small brown bottle with a pharmacist's label. Poirot examined the bottle briefly and returned it. He then asked, with great pleasantness, whether she had at any time during the evening been in the corridor leading to the study wing. She said she had not. Her eyes did not move while she said it, which was, Poirot noted, itself a kind of tell, the unconscious overcorrection of a skilled liar who has learned to control the usual signs. Dr. Edmund Torrent came next, and Poirot found him the most intellectually interesting of the early interviews. He was a man of precision, a physician, accustomed to evidence, comfortable with uncertainty, possessed of the specific courage that comes from daily proximity to mortality. He answered every question directly and without apparent concealment. And this directness had about it an ease that was either complete innocence or very good preparation. He confirmed his presence on the corridor at approximately 10:50. He had stepped out because the drawing-room was warm, and he had, here he paused with slight emphasis, a tendency to feel the heat. He had stood in the corridor for perhaps 5 minutes, breathing the cooler air. He had not gone towards the study wing. He had stood near the main staircase. He had not seen anyone else in the corridor. He acknowledged that the study corridor was accessible from the main corridor by a turning, and that if someone had been in that turning, he might not have seen them from his position. Poirot asked whether, as a physician, he could identify the symptoms consistent with potassium cyanide poisoning. Torrent said he could, and listed them with clinical composure. Poirot watched his hands throughout. They were still. Sylvia Torrent was another matter entirely. She came in with the particular brightness of a woman who has decided to be charming as a defensive strategy, and deployed her considerable beauty with the unconscious expertise of someone who has found it the most reliable instrument in her repertoire. She told Poirot about her telephone call to London, to a friend, a Mrs. Granger, whom she confirmed Poirot was free to contact. She had been at the telephone for about 15 minutes in the small room off the entrance hall, which was indeed nowhere near the study corridor. Poirot asked about her husband. A small question, lightly placed. "Was your husband in good spirits last evening, madame?" Something crossed her face. Too fast to categorize fully, but in the neighbourhood of fear. "Edmund is always composed," she said, "and his relationship with Monsieur Blackwood, it was cordial, a beat, they were acquaintances. Through me, I knew Reginald from before my marriage." "Through you," repeated Poirot gently. "I see." He did not elaborate. He thanked her and moved on. Lawrence Crane was the last of the morning's interviews, and he came in with the deliberate ease of a man who has decided in advance exactly how much he intends to reveal. He was frank about his history with Blackwood. The partnership, the dispute, the litigation. He had not wanted to come to the dinner. He had come because he wished to draw a line. "Reginald wrote to me," he said. "He said there was something he wanted to resolve. Decided to give him the chance." "And did he resolve it?" Crane's expression was difficult to read. "We didn't have the conversation. He said he'd speak to me privately after dinner. He never did." "Because he was dead," said Poirot quietly. "And what, Monsieur Crane, did you believe he wished to resolve?" Crane looked at Poirot for a long moment. "Money," he said at last. "It was always money with Reginald." Crane left. Hastings put down his pen and stretched his fingers. "Well," he said, "every single one of them had the opportunity. Most of them had a reason. We're not much further ahead, are we?" "On the contrary," said Poirot placidly, "we have learned a great deal. We have learned, for instance, that 5 out of 6 of our suspects have given us half a truth, and one has given us something considerably more careful than that." "Which one?" "That," said Poirot, rising to his feet, and smoothing the perfect lapels of his coat, "is what we shall now endeavour to determine." Chapter 5 The man who did not arrive, Arthur Peel, was found, through the moderate exertion of a single telephone call, to be residing at the Crown Hotel in Crestmore Village, where he had checked in on the afternoon of the 14th and had spent the evening of the dinner in a state of extreme agitation. According to the night porter, who had observed him pacing the first-floor corridor at intervals between 8 and midnight. He had not been at Blackwood Hall, and yet Poirot had observed names sat at the centre of the unfinished letter, like a stone at the centre of a pond, generating ripples in every direction. Peel arrived at the Hall at 2:30 in the afternoon, escorted by Constable Briggs, who had the look of a man performing an errand he only partially understood. He was 52, thin, in the manner of a man who has recently lost weight quickly. Through illness or anxiety, Poirot could not yet say. With a face that had been pleasant once, and had since been worried into something more complicated, his eyes moved quickly around the library before settling on Poirot, whom he had not expected, and in whose presence he was visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Peel," said Poirot, "you were expected last night at Blackwood Hall." "I sent a telegram," said Peel, his voice slightly unsteady. "I said I would be delayed." "You sent a telegram saying you would be delayed. You did not arrive, and yet you were in Crestmore Village throughout the entire evening. What delayed you, monsieur?" Peel was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then back at Poirot. "I couldn't face him," he said at last, with the exhausted simplicity of a man abandoning a prepared script. "I knew what he was going to say, and I couldn't face it." What Reginald Blackwood had been going to say, what he had, in Peel's assessment, gathered all his guests together to say, emerged over the next 40 minutes in fragments, each produced with the reluctance of a man dismantling the wall behind which he has been sheltering. It formed, when assembled, into a picture that Poirot found both clarifying and, in certain particulars, unexpected. Reginald Blackwood, during his 3 years abroad, had not merely been travelling. He had been conducting, with Arthur Peel as his instrument, a series of financial transactions that had at their foundation a document, a contract, that certain parties had believed destroyed, a contract pertaining to the original Blackwood Crane partnership, and to an arrangement made between Reginald and Crane that, if the document existed and were presented before a court, would establish that Lawrence Crane was owed a considerably larger sum than the litigation had awarded him. Peel had been trusted with the document. He had not destroyed it, and Reginald, returned from abroad with what Peel described as a new conscience, or something very like it, had decided that the document must be produced. He had assembled this particular group of people, all of whom were connected to the original transaction in some fashion, to put things right, in Reginald's phrase. "He wanted to confess," said Hastings, when Peel had been removed to another room, "in front of all of them." "He wanted to make restitution," Poirot corrected. "Confession benefits only the confessor. Restitution is considerably more expensive, and considerably more dangerous, because it creates immediate enemies in those who will lose by it. They considered who would lose. Lawrence Crane, obviously, stood to gain. If the document existed, the litigation could be reopened, and he would receive what he was owed. But the document's presentation would also expose the mechanism of the original fraud, and the names of those who had known about it. Felix Carrow, as solicitor, had handled aspects of the Blackwood Crane partnership. Dorothea Fenchurch had, according to Peel, advanced money to Reginald at the time of the dispute, and her loan, never publicly acknowledged, had been secured against the very settlement that Crane had received. If the settlement were overturned, her security dissolved. And there was a further element. The document that Peel had retained was not merely the original contract. It was accompanied by a letter, written in Reginald's own hand, that acknowledged the fraud in explicit terms. If that letter were produced in court, several reputations would be comprehensively destroyed. Not just financial reputations, social ones, criminal ones. Peel, in his hotel room, had spent the evening deciding what to do. He had the document. He had the letter. Reginald had telephoned him that afternoon and confirmed that he intended to produce them at dinner, or rather, to announce their existence and arrange for their formal submission. "Did Monsieur Blackwood tell you which of the guests he intended to expose?" Poirot. "He said all of them will understand tonight what I have done and what they owe," Peel quoted. "He was. I don't think he was entirely rational. He had worked himself into a state of righteousness. The most dangerous state," Poirot quietly, "for the person in it and for those around them. And the document itself, monsieur, where is it now?" Peel produced from his inside pocket a sealed envelope which he set on the table. Poirot looked at it for a moment without touching it. "You brought it with you." "I didn't know what else to do with it." "And the letter," Monsieur Blackwood's own letter acknowledging the fraud. Peel reached into the same pocket and produced a second envelope. Then he paused. Then he produced a third, smaller, different paper. "This arrived for me at the hotel this morning," he said. "Pushed under my door. I don't know who sent it." Poirot opened it carefully. Inside was a single card, printed in block capitals. "Give nothing to the police. The documents will be returned to you in exchange for your silence. Do not be a fool," as Blackwood was. He read it twice, placed it precisely on the table beside the envelopes, and looked at Hastings with an expression that combined satisfaction with something approaching sadness. "Someone," he said, "is very frightened indeed. And people who are very frightened make mistakes. Let us hope, for their sake as much as justice's, that they have not already made one that cannot be undone." Chapter 6. Poison in the Method. The Molecule. The question of the locked room had been troubling Poirot with the persistent irritation of a grain of sand in a perfectly ordered sock drawer. It was not, he had decided by the second morning, the central mystery. But it was a mechanism, and mechanisms, once understood, reveal the mind behind them. He returned to the study alone at 8 o'clock, on the morning of the 16th, while the hall's inhabitants were at breakfast. He stood again in the doorway. The same position, the same unhurried regard. And this time he was looking not for what was present, for what was inconsistent with a room that had been locked from the inside. The key in the lock. That was the starting point. Mortise lock of Victorian make, with a lever mechanism. The key projected perhaps 3 inches from the lock face on the interior side. The keyhole, on the exterior side, was a standard Victorian slot, wide in the manner of the period, with a brass plate and a simple sliding cover. Poirot crossed to the desk and looked again at the crystal dish. Empty. He looked at the wastepaper basket, which the police had examined and found to contain only a bald letter from a tailor in Bond Street, and a used stamp. He looked at the mantelpiece. He looked at the small side table. And then he got down on one knee, with somewhat more difficulty than he would have preferred, in austere posture that would have horrified him on any aesthetic ground, and examined the floor beneath the occasional table beside the leather chair. There, in the gap between the table leg and the skirting board, he found a single sugared almond. It was pink, slightly dusty, and had been there long enough to collect the fine grey debris that accumulates beneath furniture in houses where the cleaning is thorough but not quite absolute. It had not rolled there recently, but it had, Poirot estimated, been in the vicinity of the dish until some time in the past 24 hours, when the dish had been emptied. He stood with dignity, despite the knee, and turned his attention to the chimney. Inspector Thorne had confirmed that no one had passed through it, and indeed the flue was, stated, structurally impassable. But the fireplace itself, Poirot examined the grate. Cold. The ash was old, 3 or 4 days at minimum, the greyness of it, the absence of any organic warmth. No one had used this fireplace on the night of the dinner, and yet there was, on the interior left wall of the fireplace, at approximately knee-height, a small semicircular mark, recent, given its slight glossiness against the older soot, as though something round had been pressed briefly against the stone. He noted it without touching it, and moved to the window. The windows, tall sashes, Victorian double-hung, were latched on the interior, as stated. Poirot spent some moments examining, not the latches themselves, but the frames. The left window frame, nearest to the desk, had at its base a deposit of white powder, faint but measurable, in the corner joint where the lower sash met the sill. He dampened a fingertip, touched it, tasted it with the controlled experimentations of a man who has spent a lifetime in the company of poisons, and knows which ones are water-soluble. It was chalk dust, the kind produced by the erosion of old putty. This meant the window had been opened recently. The chalk dust disturbed from the aged frame, and the latch showed, when examined closely, a faint scratch on the interior face that was inconsistent with normal operation. The window could be opened, had been opened, closed and latched again from the outside, which, with a long implement and the right design of latch, was possible. Not easy, not neat, possible. The locked room was not locked from the inside by a living man. It was locked from the outside by the murderer. This altered the calculation entirely. It meant the murderer had entered the study through the window. After Reginald was dead, or incapacitated, had introduced or confirmed the effect of the poison, and had exited and relatched the window from the outside. It also explained the empty crystal dish, which sat on the occasional table within arm's reach of the window. Murderer had swept the almonds into a pocket or receptacle to prevent them from being crunched underfoot during entry. Careless, meticulous, revealing all at once. But when had the poison been introduced into the glass? Before Reginald entered the study, or after? Before. Then the murderer had access to the study in advance. If after, through the window, then the timing required extraordinary precision, because the cyanide would have killed Reginald within 15 to 30 minutes of ingestion, and the window would have had to be opened within that window. Poirot stood at the window, looking out at the November garden, a formal terrace, then a ha-ha, then the parkland beyond. The window looked south. On the night of the 14th, it would have been full dark by 5 o'clock. Terrace would have been unlit. Anyone approaching from the garden side would have been invisible from the house interior. Someone had prepared this. Someone had identified the window's manipulability in advance. Someone had known that Reginald would send the others away, retire to the study, and pour himself a brandy. Someone who knew Reginald's habits with the intimacy of long familiarity. He returned to the library and found Hastings in animated conversation with Constable Briggs about the reliability of tyre tracks in gravel. He waited until Briggs had gone, then sat across from Hastings and folded his hands. "The locked room," he said, "is an illusion, staged one. Competent hunt, but not perfect. The murderer entered through the window after Reginald was already dying, or just dead. They swept away the sugared almonds. A sensible precaution, except that one rolled under the table and survived. They relatched the window from the outside. They wished the room to appear sealed, to create confusion, to push the investigation in the direction of the impossible. But "The poison was in the glass before he drank it," said Hastings, "so it must have been put there earlier." "Yes." "And the glass was sitting on the study sideboard, in a room that was not locked during the dinner hour. Reginald locked the door himself when he entered at 10:30. But before that, between the time the guests arrived and the time Reginald went to the study door was unlocked. Anyone could have entered. So the window entry was to, what? Check that he was dead? Retrieve something? To retrieve something, said Poirot. The question is whether they found it. And the answer to that question, I believe, is no. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "The unfinished letter to Arthur Peel. It mentions something that has not been told to the others. I believe Reginald had, in the study, copy, perhaps the original, of a certain incriminating document. The murderer entered through the window to find it and remove it. Cost. They did not find it because Reginald had hidden it, or because it was not there at all. And the copy is still in Arthur Peel's possession, in 2 sealed envelopes, now locked in my briefcase in the Crown Hotel." Hastings stared at him. "Then Peel is in danger." "He is," Poirot simply. "And so, perhaps, is the next person who lets it be known that they possess the truth." Chapter 7. What the housekeeper witnessed. It was on the afternoon of the second day that Mrs. Agnes Plum approached by Poirot. With the careful respect he invariably extended to housekeepers, who in his long experience knew the interiors of houses and households, with a comprehensiveness that no other observer could achieve, produced the piece of information that she had been holding in some private deliberation since the morning after the death. She told it in the housekeeper's sitting room, a small, warm, orderly space that smelled of floor wax and lavender, for a cup of tea she had made herself, and which she pressed upon Poirot with the slightly combative insistence of a woman who associates tea with fortification for difficult conversations. He accepted it with grace, and drank it despite its unfortunate absence of a proper infusion time. "The evening of the dinner," she began, "I was in the passage outside the kitchen at approximately 9:45. The second course was being plated, when I heard the study door open and close." Poirot set down his cup with great precision. "The study door at 9:45, during dinner?" "Yes, monsieur. The kitchen passage runs alongside the rear of the east wing. The study is at the end of the east wing. I can hear the door from the passage, if the kitchen noise is not too loud." And at that moment the kitchen noise was not particularly loud. "And Monsieur Blackwood?" "He was at the dinner table at 9:45. He did not leave the table until 10:30. "That is correct. Served the second course myself. He was at the table. So if the study door opened at 9:45, it was not Monsieur Blackwood?" "No," said Mrs. Plum, "it was not." She paused, cupping her tea. "I thought nothing of it at the time. The guests sometimes wander. I did not investigate. But afterwards, after what happened, I recalled it. And I recalled something else. She had, she said, stepped briefly to the passage window for air. The kitchen was hot, and had glanced, without particular intent, towards the rear of the east wing, which was visible from the passage window at an oblique angle. She had seen a light in the study window, a small, moving light, like a handheld torch, lasting perhaps 2 minutes, then darkness. "This was at 9:45? asked Poirot. "Approximately. Perhaps 9:50. And you are certain it was the study window?" "I have lived in this house for 23 years, monsieur. I know its windows." Poirot nodded slowly. Someone had entered the study during dinner, not through the locked from inside period which came later, but during the dinner itself, when the room was unoccupied and unlocked. Someone had used a torch, because they had not wished to turn on the overhead light and risk being seen from outside. or because they did not know where the light switch was. They had spent approximately 2 minutes in the room, and they had left. This was the pre-poisoning entry. The visit during which the cyanide was introduced into the brandy glass. Not the window entry, which came later. There had been the post-mortem search, the retrieval attempt, the staging of the locked room. This was the murder itself, committed during the gap in the dinner service, when the murderer could absent themselves from the table for 3 to 5 minutes without provoking notice. He asked Mrs. Plum whether she could say with any confidence which course was being served during her time in the passage. She said the second course. A consommé with a garnish was being plated. He asked whether she remembered who had been absent from the dinner table at that point, or who had excused themselves momentarily. She said she had not been watching the table, she had been managing the kitchen. But the footman had been in and out of the dining room. The footman was James, a young man of 23 who had the magnificent advantage, from Poirot's perspective, genuinely not understanding the significance of what he had noticed. He confirmed when asked that one of the guests had excused themselves briefly during the second course. He thought for perhaps 4 or 5 minutes, and had returned before the third course was served. He had assumed they had visited the cloakroom. It had not struck him as remarkable. Which guest? Poirot asked. James thought. He was careful. He did not want to get anyone in trouble. He thought again. It was, he said, the lady with the amber dress, Mrs. Torrent. She had excused herself during the consommé, and returned before the braised pheasant. Poirot thanked him, thanked Mrs. Plum, and walked back to the library with his hands behind his back, and his pace slightly slower than usual. The pace of a man thinking very carefully through what he has just been told. Hastings was waiting for him with a report from Inspector Thorne. The analysis of the brandy glass confirmed the cyanide. The decanter and second glass were clean. The exterior face of the window latch in the study bore a faint impression, consistent with the application of a thin hooked instrument, possibly a long hairpin or a piece of wire bent at the end. A hairpin. Hastings, said Poirot, sitting down and looking at his friend steadily. Who? The women in this house might carry hairpins. Mrs. Fenchurch certainly. Her chignon requires pins. Miss Voss does not wear her hair in a pin style, Mrs. Torrent. Hastings paused. She had her hair up at dinner. Elaborate updo. Definitely require pins. And would a woman who had worn her hair up in an elaborate arrangement for a dinner party, said Poirot carefully, still have all of her hairpins at the end of the evening, or might one be missing? Hastings stared at him. You're saying she used one to open the window latch from the outside. I am saying it is consistent, and it requires one thing more. She must have known about the window. She must have known it could be opened from the outside with a thin implement. This is not knowledge one acquires by accident. This is knowledge one acquires by experiment or by prior entry. You mean she'd been in the study before? Before the dinner party, said Poirot. In the days preceding it. And that raises a question, Hastings, that I intend to put to her husband this afternoon. For I have been thinking about Dr. Torrent, and about the particular kind of unhappy vigilance he wore on the evening of the dinner. And I begin to understand, now, what he was watching for. Chapter 8. The marriage that kept its secrets. Downstairs, Dr. Edmund Torrent came to the library at 4 o'clock with the particular composure of a man who has spent 24 hours preparing for a conversation, and is not certain his preparation was sufficient. He sat with his hands on his knees, his gaze steady, and waited for Poirot to lead. Poirot, characteristically, did not lead. He opened, instead, with an observation. You have known Blackwood Hall, monsieur, the house, its rooms, its windows, for some time. You have visited previously. it was not a question, and Torrent received it as such. 3 times, he said, after a moment, in the 18 months before Blackwood went abroad. With your wife. Yes. And your wife, said Poirot with great gentleness, knew Monsieur Blackwood rather better than you did. A very long pause. Outside, the November wind moved through the elms. Somewhere in the house, door closed. Edmund Torrent looked at the fire in the library grate and said nothing for a period that lasted, by Hastings' count, nearly 20 seconds. Then he said, yes. The shape of it, as Torrent told it in the next half hour, was the oldest of stories, worn smooth with repetition throughout human history. A man absent, a wife less attached to the institution of marriage than its social forms, suggested, and another man, handsome, attentive, and unencumbered by conscience in the way that certain people are not unencumbered, but rather have simply decided, as a matter of personal philosophy, not to be burdened. The relationship between Sylvia Torrent and Reginald Blackwood had lasted, in varying intensities, for approximately 3 years before Reginald departed for the continent. It had, according to Edmund Torrent, ended when Reginald left. Not dramatically, but with the quiet dissolution of correspondence and common purpose that was, in some ways, more final than a scene. Edmund Torrent had known throughout. He had chosen, for reasons that were his own, professional reputation, social position, the stubborn hope of a man who loves imperfectly and persistently, not to act upon his knowledge. He had watched his wife, as Crane had noted, with that quiet, alert attention on the evening of the dinner. He had known that the gathering had something to do with Reginald's past. He had not known it would end in death. When you stepped into the corridor at 10:50, said Poirot, you mentioned you needed air, but I wonder, monsieur, if you also wanted to know whether your wife had visited the study corridor. Torrent was quiet. I was watching the corridor, he admitted, thought. I knew Reginald had gone to the study. I thought Sylvia might follow him. And did she? She was at the telephone. In the entrance hall telephone room, I could hear her voice. And was her voice continuous, consistent, or did there appear to be pauses? Again, the look of a man confronting something he has preferred not to see. There were pauses, he said, fairly long ones. I assumed she was listening to a friend, or, I don't know, I assumed. Poirot thanked him, and when he had gone, sat for a long moment before speaking. Then, she was not at the telephone for 15 minutes of continuous conversation, Hastings. She told us that herself. About 15 minutes. But if there were long silences, then the telephone call was a partial alibi at best. She could have stepped away from the receiver, gone to the window of the study exterior. It is accessible from the terrace. Portage is accessible from the east corridor door, which is adjacent to the telephone room. Opened the window, and returned, all within the 15-minute window. But she couldn't have been in the study during dinner, said Hastings. Footman confirmed she left the table briefly. That was the earlier visit. The window entry was after 10:30, when Reginald had locked himself in. Correct. So we have 2 visits, the dinner visit during which the poison was placed in the glass, and the later visit, through the window for the search, unless... Poirot stopped. Unless what? Unless the 2 visits were made by different people. Hastings stared at him. You mean 2 people? A conspiracy? Or a coincidence that is not a coincidence, said Poirot. 2 people who each had reasons to enter that study. 2 people who may not have known what the other was doing, and only one of whom committed murder. He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the parkland, where the last of the afternoon light was fading to charcoal. This is the difficulty with a gathering of guilty consciences, mon ami. Everyone conceals something, and when the murder occurs, every concealment looks like a motive. and every motive looks like guilt. The murderer hides in the crowd of the collectively guilty. They are safer, not in spite of the many secrets in this house, but because of them. He turned from the window. Tomorrow, I shall speak to Mrs. Torrant again, and this time I shall ask about the sugared almonds. The sugared almonds? Said Hastings, surprised. What do they have to do with Sylvia Torrant? Not everything, Hastings. Perhaps nothing. But you will recall that the dish was full before dinner, empty, when we examined the study the following morning. If Sylvia Torrant entered that room during dinner and swept the almonds away, as I believed the window intruder did, then they went somewhere. Into a pocket, a bag. And what does a woman carry to a dinner party? An evening bag, said Hastings immediately. Precisely. Small, limited in capacity, chosen for elegance rather than utility. Where does one put a handful of pink sugared almonds if one is wearing an amber evening gown with a small beaded bag? He paused. One does not. One leaves them. Or one wraps them in something. And in the study, Hastings, I noticed something I did not mention to Inspector Thorne. On the writing slope, among the pens and blotter, a square of brown waxed paper, the kind used to wrap confectionery. There. And gone, when I looked again this afternoon. Gone? Someone took it? Someone was in that room today, said Poirot quietly. Someone who knew what that paper meant. And that means the murderer is still here, in this house, and they are becoming afraid. Chapter 9. The Confession That Was Not One. It was Sylvia Torrant who came to Poirot, not the reverse, which was, he told Hastings afterwards, precisely as anticipated. Cornered animals move before they are cornered. People of intelligence, facing inevitable exposure, prefer the illusion of initiative over the reality of entrapment. She arrived at the library door at 9:30 on the evening of the second day, without announcement, wearing a dark blue dress and the expression of a woman who has made a decision. She sat down and said, "I want to tell you something." "I am listening, madame," said Poirot. "I was in the study during dinner." She said it directly, without preamble. "I went during the second course. I was gone perhaps 5 minutes. I wanted to. I had a reason to go there. And that reason was?" She looked at her hands. "Reginald had written to me before the dinner. A private letter, separate from the invitation. He said he had something he needed to tell me about our past. He said he had documents that referenced matters between us that he intended to make public as part of a broader disclosure. He said he wasn't trying to harm me, but that I should understand there might be consequences I needed to prepare for." She paused. I panicked. I thought there might be my letters, in the study. I went to look while everyone was at dinner. "And did you find them?" "No, I found nothing that was mine. I was there perhaps 4 minutes. I went through the desk drawers quickly, not neatly, I admit, and then I heard someone in the corridor, and I left immediately." "You heard someone in the corridor. And who was it?" "I don't know. I didn't see them. I went out through the study door, and back towards the dining room from the other direction. Through the passage by the kitchen. I didn't look behind me." Poirot was quiet for a moment. "Madame, during your search of the desk, did you move the crystal dish of sugared almonds, or do you recall whether it was full or empty?" She blinked at the apparent non sequitur, then said, "It was full. It was on the small side table and I didn't touch it." "You did not touch it," Poirot repeated. "And the brandy glass on the sideboard. Did you touch it, approach it, put anything near it?" "No," she said, with a flat certainty that carried to Poirot's ear the ring of truth, "touched only the desk drawers." "And the person you heard in the corridor, approaching which direction?" "From the dining room side, from the main hall side," she thought. The main hall side. They were coming from the direction of the front of the house. Poirot nodded. The main hall was accessed, among other routes, through the drawing room. Someone had left the drawing room, the gathering where post-dinner drinks had been distributed, and moved along the main hall corridor towards the study during the late evening. This would have been after 10:30, after Reginald had gone to the study himself. After the door was locked, through the window then, the window that had been opened from outside, Sylvia Torrant's information placed another person in the corridor around the time of her dinner-hour visit. A coincidence that was, Poirot suspected, no coincidence at all. "Madame," he said, "I believe you. I believe you went to the study in search of your letters and found none. I believe you did not touch the brandy glass. But I ask you to consider something carefully. The poison was in the brandy glass. Someone put it there. If it was not you, then someone was either in that room before you arrived, or after you left. After. Then the person you heard in the corridor was not merely passing. They entered the study after you vacated it during the remaining minutes of the dinner and introduced the poison." Her face had paled considerably. "Then I nearly. You were in the room very shortly before the murder was committed," said Poirot. "And had you encountered the murderer in that room, Madame, I think your situation would now be considerably more dangerous than it currently is." After she left, Hastings sat forward with an air of animated calculation. So Sylvia was in the study, but didn't poison the glass. Someone else entered after her, through the main corridor during dinner, and did. Then later the window entry was for the search. Sylvia told us the dish was still full when she left, which means the window entrant is the one who swept the almonds away. Which means, Poirot, that the dinner-hour visit and the window visit were the same person, and Sylvia preceded both of them. Or the dish was emptied by the dinner-hour visitor on the way out, with Sylvia already gone. But she said it was full when she left. She said she did not touch it. She may not have looked at it closely on her way out, moving quickly, hearing footsteps. He paused. "Cannot establish the precise sequence from testimony alone. But we are very close, Hastings. One more element, one more thread, and I know which thread to pull." "Which one?" "The thread that connects the financial document, the letter to Arthur Peel, presence in that corridor of someone who came from the direction of the main hall, someone who was in the drawing room during the post-dinner gathering, but who had, months before this evening, reason to know the layout of this house, the manipulability of that window, and the specific location of the brandy decanter." He stood, adjusted his cufflinks with minute precision, and looked at Hastings with an expression that combined sympathy with determination. "Tomorrow morning, I shall ask everyone to gather in the drawing room, and I shall tell them what happened." "You know," said Hastings. "I have known," Poirot simply, "since I asked Miss Voss about the sugared almonds. Chapter 10. The room where truths come undone." They gathered in the drawing room at 10 o'clock on the morning of the third day. The 6 guests: Inspector Thorne, Constable Briggs, Arthur Peel, brought from the Crown Hotel at Poirot's request, and Mrs. Agnes Plum, been specifically asked to attend, and who had arrived with her hands folded, and her expression that of a woman who expects confirmation of something she has long suspected. Poirot stood before the fireplace, the same fireplace before which Reginald Blackwood had stood 2 evenings ago with his glass of sherry and his prepared speech. The morning light came through the tall windows at a low November angle, striping the floor in pale gold. The fire was lit. The French clock on the mantel ticked. He began, as he always did from the beginning. "Monsieur Blackwood invited you to Blackwood Hall," he said. He did something that a man of his character found very difficult. He decided to tell the truth. Not the comfortable truth, not the truth that protects the teller, but the complete truth, which benefits others at his own cost. He had been, by his own accounting, dishonest. He had defrauded a business partner. He had concealed this fraud behind a legal settlement that was financially adequate but morally corrupt. He had involved others, some knowingly, some not, in the protection of this secret, and he had spent 3 years abroad persuading himself that this could not stand. He paused. Room was very still. Lawrence Crane stared at the fireplace with an expression of concentrated attention. The evening was designed as a confession and a reckoning. Every person in this room had some connection to the events Monsieur Blackwood intended to disclose. Some stood to benefit from the disclosure, others stood to be damaged by it, financially, professionally, personally. It was, in short, room full of people with reason to wish Monsieur Blackwood might change his mind. One of you decided to ensure that he would never have the chance to speak at all. Felix Carrow shifted in his chair. Dorothea Fenchurch's grey eyes moved to Poirot without blinking. The method was precise, Poirot continued. Potassium cyanide introduced into the brandy glass during the dinner, at the point when the study was empty and unlocked. The murderer left the dining table during the second course. A brief absence, a matter of minutes, went to the study, poisoned the glass, returned. The room was then left as normal. When Monsieur Blackwood retired to the study at 10:30, the mechanism was already in place, poured his brandy, drank and was dead within the quarter hour. He watched their faces. Sylvia Torrent had gone rigid. Edmund Torrent stared at the floor. Miss Voss had her hands flat on her knees. The locked room, Poirot said, was a subsequent elaboration. After Monsieur Blackwood was dead or dying, the murderer approached from the exterior. Through the terrace, through the south-facing window, which they had previously tested and knew could be manipulated with a thin implement from the outside. They entered the study, swept the crystal dish of almonds into a pocket to prevent them from crunching underfoot, searched the room for the documents they feared, did not find them, and exited the same way, latching the window behind them. The locked room was designed to create the impression of suicide, or, at minimum, to delay and confuse the investigation. He reached into breast pocket and produced 3 items: a small brown square of waxed paper, a single pink sugared almond in a glassine envelope, and a hairpin bagged and labelled. Waxed paper was used to collect the almonds quickly and quietly. Confectionery paper, the kind one finds in the sort of old-fashioned sweet shops that a person of particular tastes frequents. The almond survived because one rolled under the furniture in the dark. The hairpin was recovered from the exterior window ledge and is consistent with the type worn in a particular kind of formal hairstyle. He looked across the room. "Mrs. Fenchurch," he said, "your chignon on the evening of the dinner was secured with hairpins. I noticed, when you came to speak with me the following morning, that one section of your hair was secured differently, with a clip rather than a pin. A small adjustment, kind one makes when a pin has been lost." Dorothea Fenchurch looked at him with her February eyes. She said nothing. "You were in the corridor at 10:50, by your own account, with a headache. But you were not in the cloakroom for 12 minutes, madame. You were on the terrace, approaching the study window. You had the time. The cloakroom is adjacent to the east corridor door. You had the means, the hairpin, and the knowledge of the window's manipulability from your 3 previous visits to this house during the period of your relationship with Monsieur Blackwood, in the course of which you had, on at least one occasion, entered the study by that same window, when Reginald had locked himself in from the inside. a domestic habit of his that you knew well. The room had the quality of absolute suspension. No one breathed. And you had, Poirot said quietly. The motive, not financial. The financial element was real. The document, once produced, would have destroyed the security you held against Reginald's debt. But the motive that drove you to act that evening, madame, was not the money. It was the letter. Reginald's letter to Arthur Peel, which acknowledged not only the financial fraud, but something else, something personal, which he intended to include in his disclosure. A disclosure that would have revealed the full nature of your relationship with him, part you played in facilitating the original contract fraud, in a form that your professional reputation could not survive. Mrs. Fenchurch said, very steadily, you cannot prove the personal element. I can, said Poirot, because Arthur Peel has the letter, complete letter. And you did not find it when you searched the study, because it was never there. It was in Peel's hotel room, and the note slipped under his door warning him to remain silent was, I'm afraid, in your handwriting. I compared it this morning with the note you wrote to Miss Voss on the evening of the first day, asking to borrow her headache powder. The capital A, particular formation of the letter R. They are identical. Dorothea Fenchurch closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were no less steady than before, but the quality of their steadiness had changed. It was now the steadiness of a person who has stopped maintaining something. He was going to destroy me, she said. Her voice was even, almost conversational. 29 years. I gave him 29 years of loyalty, of covering, of managing, of keeping silent, and he was going to stand in that dining room and tear it all down, as though it were nothing more than a bad business decision he'd decided to write off. Nobody spoke. He did not deserve, she said, to be protected by my silence and undone by his own conscience. It is not just. No, Poirot, very gently. It is not just. Very little in this case is just. But murder, madame, is also not just, and it is, additionally, illegal. Inspector Thorne stepped forward. Chapter 11. Every thread accounted for after Mrs. Fenchurch had been removed with the careful dignity that, as Inspector Thorne saw to his credit, invariably extended even to those he was arresting. Drawing room held a peculiar silence, the silence of people who have been watching something build for 3 days and are now sitting in the wreckage of its conclusion, unsure whether what they feel is relief or grief, or some compound of both that has no precise name. Poirot remained before the fireplace. He had not moved during Thorne's intervention, and he did not move now. He looked at the faces before him, each one processing, each one privately recalibrating the meaning of the last 36 hours, and addressed them with the measured patience of a man who believes that explanation is not merely professional courtesy, but a form of respect owed to those who endured the investigation. You will want to know, he said, how each piece fitted the whole. It is only fair that you should. He began with the timeline. Dorothea Fenchurch, whose relationship with Reginald Blackwood stretched back 29 years, had received his letter of invitation with a private understanding that it contained a threat to everything she had built since the fraud. Her position, her reputation, her financial security. She had arrived at Blackwood Hall on the evening of the 14th, having already decided that the evening could not be permitted to proceed as Reginald intended. She had been to this house 3 times before, said Poirot. She knew the study's geography. She knew Reginald's habits. The brandy after dinner was as regular as the tide. She knew the window could be opened from the outside. She had done it herself on a previous visit. It was a small private joke between them in happier days. She had tested it on the morning of the dinner, arriving early under the pretext of wishing to speak to Reginald privately before the other guests. Hastings noted this. She was here early, before the others? She was, Mrs. Plum confirmed when I asked this morning that Mrs. Fenchurch arrived at 3 in the afternoon, a full 4 hours before the other guests. Reginald received her in the drawing-room and they spoke briefly. Mrs. Plum did not hear the content of the conversation, but she observed that when Mrs. Fenchurch left the drawing-room, she walked towards the east wing. She said she wished to freshen up in the guest room she had been allocated. The guest room, however, is on the west wing. She went to test the window, said Hastings. Pause. She went to test the window, confirmed Poirot, and to familiarise herself with the approach from the terrace side, which she would need to navigate in full darkness later. She was thorough, she was prepared. This is what made her, as a murderer, so nearly perfect. She had considered everything in advance, he continued. Poison had been obtained. Thorne had confirmed this through a rapid inquiry. Following Poirot's suggestion, chemist in the town nearest to Mrs. Fenchurch's home, some 40 miles from Crestmore, under a false name, 6 weeks prior to the dinner. The method of introduction had been simple. A small amount carried in a gelatine capsule of the kind used for medicine, dissolved directly into the poured glass. During her 4-minute visit to the study at 9:45, the capsule itself had been swallowed or disposed of subsequently. It was immaterial. The cyanide dissolved rapidly in spirits. The brandy glass, Poirot explained, was the single vulnerability in her plan. She needed to know which glass Reginald would use. Reginald was a man of habit. Mrs. Plum confirmed that he always used the left-hand glass of the pair on the sideboard, habit acquired, because that glass was slightly thinner, and he preferred its balance in the hand. Mrs. Fenchurch knew this. She had sat in that study dozens of times. He addressed Felix Carrow directly. Monsieur Carrow, you told me that Reginald telephoned 3 days before the dinner about the will's contestability. You now understand why. He had decided on restitution, and he wished to confirm that his arrangements, including, I suspect, revised will that restored a portion of his estate to Lawrence Crane, could not be undone by claims of undue influence or post-mortem legal action. He was, in his way, being careful. Carrow nodded. The revised will, he said quietly, was in my briefcase on the night of the dinner. He had signed it that afternoon. It leaves a substantial sum to Crane and establishes a trust for Miss Voss, revoking several earlier bequests. Lawrence Crane looked up sharply. Harriet Voss looked at her hands. The earlier bequests, said Poirot, included, I believe, substantial provision for Mrs. Fenchurch. A very substantial one, said Carrow, and there it was entire. The financial motive, personal motive, the professional motive, threaded together through 29 years of a relationship that had been, at various times, love affair, a business partnership, and a mutual conspiracy. When Reginald decided to unravel it all, Dorothea Fenchurch had faced not merely exposure but erasure of the life she had built, the position she held, the security she had secured. She had chosen, with great clarity and very little hesitation, to act before he could speak. Poirot addressed the room one final time. I will add one thing, because it bears on the conduct of everyone here. Several of you concealed things during this investigation. Motives, movements, relationships. You did so for reasons that were understandable, if not always commendable. But the consequence of collective concealment is that the murderer is given shelter in the crowd of the guilty. Monsieur Crane, your affair with Blackwood, was known to several and admitted to none. It was irrelevant, but its concealment complicated the picture. Dr. Torrent, you watched your wife and said nothing, also irrelevant to the murder. but a silence that cost 2 days' progress. Mrs. Torrent, your visit to the study was concealed until you judged that disclosure served your interests better than silence, Miss Voss. You knew more about the revised will than you acknowledged. Harriet Voss looked up. Reginald told me, she said, the week before the dinner. I didn't say anything because I thought. I was afraid it would make me look as though I had a reason to want him alive. And then, when he died, I thought if I admitted it, it would make me look as though I had something to protect. The logic of the innocent person caught in extraordinary circumstances, said Poirot, not without sympathy. It rarely serves them well. He looked around the room for the last time. The documents will be handled by Mr. Carrow and Mr. Peel in consultation with Mr. Crane. The revised will is valid. Reginald Blackwood's attempt at restitution will, in the form of his estate, proceed as he intended. Somewhat late, and at a cost none of us would have wished, but proceed nonetheless. He took his hat from the table beside him and turned towards the door. And now, if you will forgive me, I have been away from London for 3 days, and there is a concert at the Wigmore Hall on Friday that I am determined not to miss. Chapter 12. What the Little Grey Cells Perceived. They drove back to Crestmore village in the hired motor car, Poirot and Hastings, through the elm-canopied lane in a thin November rain that turned the grey sky pewter and made the road shine. The hall receded in the rear window, all stone and tall chimney stacks and impermeable dignity, until a bend in the lane took it from view entirely, though it had been a stage set dismantled while the audience was still leaving. Hastings drove, which was a matter of some negotiation on every occasion, as Poirot was not a confident passenger, and expressed this through periodic, small vocalizations and the practised gripping of the door handle. For the first mile he sat in silence, not the silence of inattention, but the settling silence of a mind that has been running at full engagement for 3 days, and is now allowing itself carefully to slow. The sugared almonds, said Hastings eventually. That was when you knew. You said so. When Miss Voss told me the dish had been full before dinner, Poirot confirmed, and when the dish was empty upon examination the following morning, this told me 2 things simultaneously. First, that someone had entered the study after Reginald was dead, or at minimum his fatal drink, and had made a deliberate effort to move the almonds to prevent noise during movement in the room. Second, that this person had been either in the study previously, during the dinner hour, and knew the dish was there, or, and this is what made me focus, had visited the study so many times before that the dish was simply a known feature of the room. The almond dish was on the small occasional table beside the leather chair, not in the centre of the room. Person who had been in that room only once or twice, moving quickly in the dark with a torch, might not even notice it until they stepped on one. Someone who knew the room intimately would know exactly where it was and go straight for it, said Hastings. Précisément. They swept the dish immediately upon entering. It was the first thing they did. Not something a stranger would think of. Something a person does instinctively in a room they know as well as their own. Hastings drove through the village, past the Crown Hotel, where Arthur Peel was presumably packing his bag, past the church with its square Norman tower, past the post office with its closed sign. And the hairpin? The hairpin was confirmatory, not primary, but it was Mrs. Fenchurch's chignon the following morning that first drew my attention. That single section secured differently, with a clip. Person who uses pins for such a precise arrangement does not lose a pin by accident without the arrangement showing. The adjustment was deliberate. She had lost a pin and replaced it with what she had available. and she'd used the pin to open the window latch from outside. A long hat pin curved at one end. The scratch on the latch was consistent with it, and the chalk dust from the window frame that confirmed the window had been recently, even though it was latched when we found it. She had done it neatly, but not perfectly. No one does anything perfectly under the kind of pressure she was operating under. The motor car came to the Crown Hotel and stopped. Poirot did not immediately move to get out. He sat looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man finishing a thought rather than beginning one. "The thing that saddens me," he said, and his voice, when he said it, was not the voice of professional analysis, but something quieter, more personal, "is not the crime. The crime was, in its own cold way, logical, Mrs. Fenchurch was a person of intelligence, operating under extreme fear, and she made a calculation that the cost of silence was worth the cost of action. She was wrong, but she was not incomprehensible. No, what saddens me is the waste. Reginald Blackwood, who had done wrong and had decided to make it right. He should have lived to make that restitution. He should have stood in that dining room and said his difficult truths and borne the consequences. That is not a perfect resolution. It is a human one, and it was taken from him." Hastings was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he'd changed? Really changed?" "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that he had reached the stage of change that is the hardest and rarest. The stage where one decides to act rather than merely intend. Whether the change was complete, whether it would have endured, whether his motives were entirely pure, these we cannot know. But the action itself, the gathering of those people, the prepared letter, document he had kept and planned to produce, that was not the action of a man performing change for an audience. That was the action of a man who had decided finally to pay what he owed. He opened the car door and stepped out into the rain with the careful precision of a man who has principles about shoes and does not compromise for weather. He produced a small umbrella from somewhere about his person and opened it with a satisfying click. "The little grey cells," said Hastings from the car, with the comfortable familiarity of a man who has heard this phrase for many years and still finds it worth repeating. "What do they do when a case is over?" Poirot turned. The ghost of a smile appeared beneath the absurd symmetry of his moustaches. "They rest, mon ami. They file everything in its correct place. They note what was learned. And then," he raised his umbrella slightly, though in small salute to the rain, the elm trees, the November sky, and the complicated, irreducible human nature that kept providing him with employment. "They wait, with the patient certainty of long experience, for the next one." He turned towards the hotel entrance. 4 steps, perfectly placed on the dry portions of the pavement. Hastings watched him go with the expression of a man who has, despite everything, thoroughly enjoyed himself, and made a note in the small book he kept in his breast pocket. Blackwood Hall case concluded. D. Fenchurch arrested. R.B.'s restitution to proceed via estate. The almonds. Never forget the almonds. He closed the notebook, started the motor, and drove. Chapter 13. The estate settles its accounts. The weeks that followed the events at Blackwood Hall moved with a characteristic rhythm of legal consequence. Methodical, unhurried, and productive of paperwork in quantities that would have appalled Reginald Blackwood, had always regarded solicitors as a necessary evil to be consulted briefly and billed modestly. Felix Carrow managed it all with the quiet efficiency of a man for whom the administration of other people's complicated legacies was simply the substance of a life's work, and who brought to it neither relish nor resentment, merely competence. The revised will, signed by Reginald on the afternoon of the 14th, the day of the dinner, the day of his death, was valid. Its execution took some months, contested wills often do. For Dorothea Fencher's solicitors, retaining the reflexive combativeness of their profession, Post raised certain objections on the grounds that their client was named in an earlier will as a substantial beneficiary, and had been removed without adequate consultation. The objections were heard, examined and dismissed. The revised will stood. Lawrence Crane received a sum which, combined with the original settlement, went some way, not all the way, but some, towards repairing the financial injury of the original fraud. He accepted it without ceremony, and declined to speak publicly about the matter, restraint that surprised those who had expected American directness to manifest as dramatic commentary. He returned to his offices in London, and was, by all subsequent accounts, moderately more inclined to trust the English legal system than he had previously been, which placed him at about the level of cautious scepticism rather than active contempt. Miss Harriet Voss inherited a trust sufficient to enable her to pursue, without the anxiety of impecuniosity, the academic career she had been delaying for 3 years in the hope that her uncle would provide some indication of his intentions. She returned to Edinburgh, where she was completing a doctorate in classical archaeology, and was observed by her fellow students to be somewhat quieter than before, but no less sharp. She wrote to Poirot some months later a brief, careful letter, thanking him for the clarity of his investigation, and adding in a postscript that he found the most interesting part, that she had always known her uncle had been dishonest, and had hoped during the years of his absence that he was becoming better. She was glad, she wrote, that his last decision had been a good one. Arthur Peel retired from financial advising at the end of the year, somewhat ahead of schedule. He relocated to the Cornish coast, where he was said to keep a garden of concentrated neatness, and to have developed, late in life, passion for sea fishing. He did not give interviews. He did not write a memoir. He appeared, in all external indicators, to be a man who had decided that silence was the appropriate tribute to events that no longer required his participation. Dr. Edmund and Sylvia Torrent. This was perhaps the most quietly significant development, separated in the spring following the case by mutual and apparently amicable arrangement. Sylvia moved to Paris, where she had friends and where her considerable personal attractions found an audience less complicated by history. Edmund continued his surgical practice, and was, by the following Christmas, said by those who knew him to appear lighter, a word that meant, in this context, not diminished but relieved of a weight that had been pressing him downward for years. He sent Poirot a note at Easter, brief and gracious, thanking him for conducting the investigation with what he called an unusual combination of precision and decency. Poirot kept the note. He kept very few. Dorothea Fenchurch was tried at the Crown Court in the following spring, and convicted of murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. She received the sentence with the same controlled composure she had carried through every event of the preceding months, and made no statement to the court, the press, or anyone else. She looked, according to the single newspaper reporter permitted to sketch her, like a woman who had made a decision, and was not prepared to regard it as a mistake, even in retrospect. Whether this was genuine resolve or an extremely well-maintained performance, it was impossible to say. Poirot, when asked by Hastings, said he thought it was probably both. Blackwood Hall itself was sold in the autumn, passed to a family from Surrey. A solicitor and his wife, with 3 children who found the house's long corridors ideal for exactly the kind of enthusiastic running that old corridors are built in principle to discourage. The new owners replaced the French clock on the drawing-room mantel with a bracket clock of their own. They put up fresh curtains in the east wing. They found, in clearing the study, a small crystal dish behind some books on the lowest shelf, put it on a windowsill in the kitchen, where it held paper clips and miscellaneous small coins. The sugared almonds, when Hastings heard this detail second-hand from Constable Briggs, now promoted in a modest way to sergeant, became a point of some amusement in the retelling. The single pink almond that had rolled under a table and survived to give Poirot his first certainty. In the story as Hastings told it to his club over the following years, the almond assumed an almost mythological significance. The accidental survivor, the small witness, the irreducible detail that a careful murderer had almost eliminated, but not quite. It's always something like that, Hastings would say, refilling his glass, to whichever colleague or acquaintance had been patient enough to listen to the whole of it. Poirot says the criminal makes one mistake that breaks the plan. But, in my experience, it's usually something smaller. It's the almond that rolled too far. It's the hairpin section done differently. It's the chalk dust on a windowsill. Something so small that you'd think the whole universe was conspiring to record it. And at Whitehaven Mansions, where the sock drawer remained impeccably organised, and the Wigmore Hall concert had been attended and declared excellent, Hercule Poirot would have agreed, in his careful way, with this assessment, while adding the modest correction that the universe does not conspire, merely, and with absolute consistency, preserves the evidence of what actually happened. The task of the detective is simply to be the kind of person who notices it. Chapter 14. A postcard from Whitehaven Mansions. Hastings received the postcard 6 weeks after the conclusion of the Blackwood Hall case, forwarded from his club to his temporary address in Knightsbridge, where he was staying with a cousin while his own flat underwent the renovation it had required for the past several years, and received at intervals too brief for completion. Postcard bore a reproduction of a painting, a Dutch interior, a figure at a window, grey light on a tiled floor, and on the reverse, precise, very small handwriting that Poirot used for correspondence, was the following: Monsieur Hastings, I have been thinking about Blackwood Hall, as one does after a case of that particular kind. Not about the solution, which was, I admit, satisfying in the way that correctly assembled things are satisfying. About the people, Reginald Blackwood, who decided, too late, to be honest. Mrs. Finchurcher, who decided, too early, that honesty was a threat rather than a relief. The distance between these two decisions was 29 years and one dinner party. This seems to me worth thinking about. Come to dinner on Thursday. I am making a cassoulet. It will not be authentic, but it will be very good. H.P. Hastings read this twice, turned the postcard over, looked at the Dutch interior, the figure at the window, grey light, and placed it on his desk beside the small notebook in which he had written, among other things, the words, "Never forget the almonds." He went to dinner on Thursday. The cassoulet was, as promised, not authentic. It was also, as promised, very good, rich with duck confit and beans, and the kind of sausage that requires a specific expedition to a particular shop in Soho that only Poirot knew how to find, and which Hastings had never successfully located on his own. They ate at the small table by the window of the flat at Whitehaven Mansions, with the sounds of London moving below them in the dusk, drank a half-bottle of Burgundy that Poirot had selected with the deliberation he brought to all choices involving wine or socks. They did not speak about Blackwood Hall until after the cassoulet was cleared and the cheese was on the table. A camembert at exactly the correct stage of ripeness, which Poirot had achieved by some private calculation he refused to share. at which point Hastings said, because the question had been sitting in him for 6 weeks, "Did you know it was her from the beginning?" From before the almonds, even. Poirot considered this, with the honesty he always brought to questions about his own process. "I knew," he said at last, "that it was someone with intimate knowledge of the house and of Reginald's habits." This reduced the field considerably, but did not eliminate it. Mrs. Fenchurch's relationship with Blackwood, though not publicly known, was not entirely invisible to those who knew where to look. The way she spoke of him, a particular quality of her control when she mentioned his name. Control of that precision indicates intimacy. Only people who have been very close exercise that much care over their reactions. But the almonds were the proof. The almonds were the first proof that a person with specific knowledge of the room had entered it after death. Once I had that, could build backwards, to the window, to the hairpin, to the earlier dinner-hour visit, to the chalk dust. Each element confirmed, none invented. He took a small piece of cheese and regarded it with satisfaction. There is a thing, I find, Hastings, a thing that differentiates the cases that resolve cleanly from those that do not. In a clean case, every element has a place. There is nothing left over and nothing missing. The motive produces the action produces the evidence produces the truth. When a case does not resolve cleanly, it is because one has not yet found the element that connects them. The almonds were that element here, a small thing, forgotten in the excitement of the locked room and the cyanide analysis. But the small things are always where the truth is kept, 'cause they're the things the murderer didn't worry about, said Hastings. Because they are the things the murderer could not anticipate needing to control, Poirot corrected. No murderer, however intelligent, can anticipate every variable. They can plan the large things, the method, the timing, the alibi. But the crystal dish, the stray almond, the chalk dust, the hairpin. These are the witnesses who attend every crime and are never asked to leave because they are too small to be noticed, till someone notices them. Outside, London moved and murmured in its impervious way. The gas fire hissed. On the mantelpiece, a small ormolu clock, precise, French, and recently dusted, marked the half-hour with a chime of silver clarity. Hastings refilled his glass and leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man in a place he has sat many times and considers, in some fundamental sense. Home. What's next? He asked. It was always what came next, eventually. Poirot. The sense that the ending of one thing was simply the clearing of space for another. Poirot set down his cheese knife and aligned it precisely with the bread plate. He folded his hands. He looked at his friend with those pale green eyes that had looked at so many terrible things and remained, through all of it, precisely what they were. Eyes that saw, that remembered, that connected, that, in the final account, refused to let what happened go unwitnessed. Next, he said pleasantly, I shall finish the cassoulet. Then I shall consider the correspondence that arrived this morning, which contains a most peculiar letter from a gentleman in Norfolk, who believes his neighbour's prize-winning orchid collection is being systematically poisoned by persons unknown. Whether this constitutes a matter worthy of Poirot's little grey cells, I have not yet determined. Paused. A slight gleam. But the orchids, he added with the faintest trace of something that was in its controlled Belgian way, anticipation, quite extraordinarily rare. And, in my experience, when something extraordinarily rare is systematically destroyed, reasons are never as simple as horticulture. Hastings smiled. Outside, the last of the November light left the London sky entirely, and the city settled into its amber evening self, as it had done every night for centuries, and would do for centuries more. Indifferent, ancient, full, as ever, of people keeping secrets that someone, eventually, would be patient enough to find.